Kia ora koutou, no mai haere mai. I'm Christine Argyle and I want to welcome you to this New Zealand Choral Federation Q&A session with Professor Michael Baker on choirs and COVID-19 in the New Zealand Alert Level 2 context. Professor Baker is one of New Zealand's leading epidemiologists and is part of the Ministry of Health's COVID-19 Technical Advisory Group. Now, I don't believe Michael is a singer himself, but he's surrounded by choral singers in his household with a wife, son and daughter who, between them, sing in a community chamber choir, a secondary school choir and a community children's choir. Welcome, Michael.
Yeah, kia ora. And it's great to be with all of you tonight. And yes, I am immersed in choral singing and go to lots of nota bene events, which I really enjoy. And yes, we're all living through this unique experience, and it seems quite unreal at times that this could have happened in this modern age. And I think there's going to be a lot of soul searching when this is over about why this happened and how we could prevent it. But as I think we're all aware, we're fortunate to be living in Aotearoa, which with a few other countries is heading down the elimination path. And it means that if all of us are able to change our behaviour for a period, then we can emerge into a virus-free New Zealand, I think, in the foreseeable future. And so a lot of the discussions, as you know, of these different levels are about where we are at the moment, which may not be, it's not forever. That's the great hope.
Thanks, Michael. Well, we're joined on screen as well this evening by the chair of the New Zealand Choral Federation, Juliet Dreaver, and the chair of the NZCF Association of Choral Directors, David Squire.
Kia ora.
And thank you to everyone who has sent in questions for this session. Between Juliet, David and myself, we'll do our best to cover them all in our precious time with Professor Baker. And we're hoping the technology won't fail us, but in the event that it does, please do stay tuned and we'll get things back up and running as quickly as possible. And also for any of your colleagues who are unable to watch tonight, we'll be recording this session and it'll be available via the same link you used to join us tonight and via the homepage of the NZCF website. Michael, I just wanted to start off by saying that there has been some confusion since the announcement this Monday regarding the number of participants allowed in a choral rehearsal. Choirs were not specified and some have interpreted the limits to being something like, you know, the equivalent to going to a restaurant or a bar or a cinema, while others assume that choirs fall under the same restrictions as churches and other social gatherings, which are currently limited to 10 people. Can you clarify that?
Sure, but I think it's just worth pausing for a moment to realise why we're worried about transmission in these settings. And it's because of the unusual features of this virus that people tend to be infectious for a couple of days before they have symptoms. And we know that almost all transmission happens indoors, and that just normal breathing, laughing, and of course singing expels viral particles. And more vigorous activities, obviously, like singing, expel more. So if the rules are really around preventing this event, which we hope is unlikely, so that's the reason that we have to all think very hard about the principles of minimizing transmission. And risk is all about duration and proximity. So if we just, and I think everyone knows that, but that's what we have to think about, and also barriers that we put in the way, like masks and so on.
So if we're listening to the government guidelines, we should take our cue from what the guidelines are for churches. That would be the equivalent for us, do you think?
I think that's a reasonable start. When you look down the guidelines, they're pretty clear that they don't want groups, they're not recommending groups of over 10 and duration for more than 2 hours. So it's very much sticking with those principles of limiting transmission, and also obviously larger groups. If people know each other, there's closer proximity because we just get closer to people we know.
People have said that singers are huggy people. You know, we do tend to hug each other. Well, look, I'll hand over to Juliet for some other questions now.
Well, kia ora, Michael. We've just been talking about the difference between singing and talking and laughing and socializing generally, Has there been research that you've seen that actually specifically looks at singing, and how much of a greater risk, or does it pose a greater risk than those activities, in your opinion?
Yeah, it definitely does. And really, you may be expelling about 20 viral particles a minute with just normal talking, but many times more than that with singing. And you need probably maybe 1,000 particles would constitute an infectious dose. So it means maybe an hour of face-to-face talking is enough to get infected, but much less than that if you're singing, or obviously a lot of laughter and so on. Obviously things we want to encourage, but that does mean these are higher risk situations.
And does that also play out in contact sport? So with panting, heavy breathing, or is the issue there that tends to take place outside rather than in indoor venues?
Yeah, I think that would be a big factor, because almost all the outbreaks and transmission are happening indoors, in people's homes, or even crowded public transport, workplaces, and particularly social events. And as you mentioned, there's some very well described outbreaks overseas. Of course, nothing compares with a sneeze or a cough, which can expel 20 million particles in a single sneeze, and they have a big range. So that's obviously a great way to clear the room if that occurs.
We were discussing earlier a widely watched discussion, a webinar that took place that was based in the States that just caused a lot of concern in the US, with a suggestion that choirs may not be able to resume rehearsals until there's a vaccine available. So that's pretty alarming news for the choral world to hear. Our situation is vastly different to what's playing out in the States, and it looks as if we will be able to say pretty soon that we've eliminated it from our communities. So the fundamental question is, for us, for New Zealand, is what do you think would be the conditions for safe or safe enough return to choirs gathering? And how close, well, I shouldn't really ask you, how close do you think we are to getting there? That depends on us rather than you, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, we're in this, we've got through the acute phase. So fortunately, we're not on the exponential rise. We're now into this area which really very few countries have been into, the state now where you're pre-elimination. And roughly the definition will be a month with no new cases. There's a few details about that. Obviously, that excludes people who just arrived back in the country and safely quarantined at the border. So there's a lot of details still being decided. So theoretically, once the virus is gone, once it's eliminated, we can return to life just about in just about a normal state. And that's really, I think, will be level one. And obviously the details will get refined as to what level one is, but it should involve not that many controls within New Zealand. Obviously the borders are the main focus. So I think the overseas guidelines, of course, is the main thing we see for countries that have endless circulating virus in various stages of suppression. And so life will be very different there than what is possible here.
And meanwhile, I guess we'll follow what guidelines we have in terms of getting as close to normal as possible. And one of those will be to do with distancing. So the recommendations on distancing talk about 1 to 2 meters, depending on which set of guidelines you read. But there is also research suggesting that aerosols can travel much further than that and hang around in the air, depending on the amount of ventilation in the room and other things about the environment. So from your point of view, when choirs resume rehearsals, what do you think would be a safe distance for choral singers to stand apart from each other?
Yeah, well, if we're talking about obviously at level 2, where you could have groups of up to 10, then I would say a minimum of 2 meters. And again, trying to have your rehearsals in large halls where ventilation isn't an issue would be, I think, a very good approach.
So not too close and with airflow, and reducing the duration of rehearsals.
Yeah, well, I think the 2-hour limit, which is suggested for groups of up to 10, seems reasonable. I'm not sure how many of your choirs can operate. Obviously, most of the choirs are much bigger than that, but whether you can choose different pieces to work on and so on, which can have smaller permutations.
Lots of sectionals. The other thing that people have been thinking about is the placement of singers. Some groups like to sing in a circle formation or in smaller groups. Do you think it would be safer to ensure that everybody's facing in the same direction? I
think that would be very sensible. Like a lot of things we do, there isn't really hard evidence. So that would seem like a very good approach.
And that, of course, means that everybody's facing the conductor. I don't know if you've thought about this yourself, but I think every conductor in the country is probably thinking about how they might be able to protect themselves from facing a large number of people for 1 or 2 hours and having them breathing at them. Any thoughts there about the conductor's distance?
Yeah, I think, again, increasing the distance, I don't have a particular figure in mind, but I think several meters, as far as is practical, would be, I think, a good policy.
Michael, if I can just pick up now on churches and congregational singing. We have a number of church choirs amongst our Choral Federation choirs, and also singers who like to be part of congregational singing. And of course, for churches, this is a big part of their worship. Once the numbers for churches and choirs go up to, let's say, 50 or more, and churches are able to reconvene, some have asked, will it be possible or advisable to reintroduce congregational singing, or are the risks of singing great enough that congregational singing should be avoided until level 1?
Well, I don't think as much choice as there until level 1 because of the size limit. So I think we're going to be a maximum of 10 until that point, unless you're thinking of very small groups.
Well, the Prime Minister did say that at the moment it's a maximum of 10, and then she suggested that in a couple of weeks that might go up to 20 or even 50. But is that not what you're hearing?
I haven't actually picked up on that. That's a good point. A lot will depend. I mean, in the end, most restrictions should disappear at level 1. If we've achieved elimination, you have to think what precautions are still justifiable. Of course, we are coming into winter. The virus, if it's still present, will be is slightly more transmissible then. So I think one of the scenarios is we haven't achieved elimination by then. So things could get a little bit tougher. But I think once we get to level 1, which I think is highly likely, then I think we'll see most restrictions removed because they won't be very sensible anymore if there's no circulating virus. And we're very confident of that.
So you don't envisage that level 2 will be a very long, protracted new normal for a long time. You are hoping, it sounds, that we will move through level 2 into level 1 reasonably quickly.
Well, this is up to the virus and up to the behaviour of the New Zealand population, and also a degree of good fortune, because you can have mistakes made at the borders and mistakes can happen in other places. So that's really the issue now, I think.
Mm-hmm. Going back to churches, and one of the issues they have as well is of course, an ageing demographic often, and that's something that's also common to some of our community choirs. A number of people who've written in with questions for tonight are concerned about their community choir with a number of singers who are 70 plus. Mm-hmm. And wondering again whether there's particular advice for people over 70 who sing in choirs, or whether they should just simply not be considering returning to rehearsals until we're in level 1, even if they put hygiene measures and so on in place.
Well, I think it's going to be very much equivalent to whether they feel comfortable joining other social groups of a similar size. And it does depend, I think, on your overall state of health. I mean, the general cutoffs are a little bit arbitrary, but people over 70 and people with underlying illnesses. But there's always degrees there, and there'll be some people who are quite immune compromised who really wouldn't want to be engaging with any much contact outside their home. Whereas others, it's obviously a very good part, a very important part of their lives, and they're otherwise very healthy. So I think it just depends. I think it is an individual choice at this stage. There's nothing mandatory about this.
Mm. And would the situation be different if you live in an area, a regional area where they've had almost no cases, and or do we always have to assume that there can be the silent carrier who's come into your region and that at any moment, it may turn from none to one and more?
Mm. Well, that is the assumption that I think everyone has to make. And until we're in level 1, we're asking people to assume that the person in front of them is infectious. And the risk is getting smaller, but it's not zero yet. And that's why we hope level 2 will be short, i.e. only a month.
Mm. A question that's come up, and I know it's something that you've been talking about a lot lately, is masks. And masks for singing, that's an interesting question, because I think personally I can't imagine it being very comfortable breathing in the way that you exhale with singing into a mask over a period of an hour or so. And I wonder whether it's even actually safe to be wearing a mask and exhaling to that degree for that period of time.
Yeah, well, I think masks are an important safeguard in other settings, and we've been suggesting for the transport system where people are forced into closer proximity, just to allow buses and trains and aircraft to work normally and be fully full of people, basically not having to have empty rows. I'm not sure they have much of a role to play in for choral singing. I can see it's not obviously a natural combination. And I think really we're mainly waiting for level 1 where we can resume business as usual. I think level 2 is that intermediate period where we've got these guidelines that I think we need to follow. And I don't think, obviously masks would add another barrier, but I'm just not sure it's compatible with getting something useful out of choral singing compared with the very ingenious things you're now doing using Zoom meetings and so on, which must be quite interesting as a different experience.
Yeah, that's true. Michael, I'm going to hand over to David now, who's got a series of questions, particularly about schools, because we're a bit confused about the rules for community choirs, and are they the same for schools? So I'll hand over to David for that.
Kia ora, Michael. Just a question. Obviously, schools are going back next week, and they're obviously allowed to have 30 plus students in a room for lessons. So does that mean that they can bring their choirs together to rehearse as well, providing they're following the rules of spacing out?
Well, my reading of the guidelines for schools is they can do that, but it is a question of whether that's desirable at the moment, whether parents are feeling they're just getting comfortable with schools again, and whether they might, for some of them, regard this as an added stress, the idea of having lots of school students from other schools coming together, because we've just got over the idea of having our extended bubbles. So I would have thought that might be something to put on hold for a little while unless it's absolutely critical.
Sure. There's also been a question asked that the 10-person limit that's in place currently under level 2, that obviously does not apply to school choirs at the moment.
That's my reading of the rules, yes.
Sure. Some school choirs are all-comers choirs, and so are some community choirs, and presumably that they should follow a sign-in policy for members with contact details so that there can be contact tracing.
Yeah, I think that's a general principle for all gatherings, that you have that ability to contact trace.
The other thing is that in a lot of schools there are singing classes, so classrooms that actually have singing as a part of their curriculum. Can they go ahead safely provided those protocols are being kept in place?
Yeah, I think so. You may have noticed that the standards for schools are different from other environments. And one of the reasons is, and this is one of the great mysteries with this virus, is that we're not seeing lots of transmission between students at schools and even in early childhood centres. And that makes it unique in the viruses I've encountered professionally, that generally kids are the greatest virus transmitters of all the respiratory viruses, influenza, gastro, rotavirus, norovirus. Anyone who's had kids knows they bring them home and they share them around. So the default option was that schools are a high-risk environment. The kids get infected as much as adults. They have a high viral load, but they just don't seem to infect lots of people around them. So that is unresolved, but it's good. I mean, it means that it seems that the school environment is relatively safer for, obviously it's opening up and there's going to be quite big gatherings in some schools.
Mm. One of the things that we've talked about obviously is the difference between the rules for schools and community choirs. But we also have community choirs such as children's choirs where members come from a number of different schools around the city, but they are still children. Should they be sticking to that limit of 10 as well?
Yeah, again, I think this might be an activity to put off for a couple of weeks till things have settled down and people are feeling comfortable with the school environment, that they can manage it effectively, and then consider greater mixing of schools and students from different schools. I think the rules allow it. I just think it might be an activity to defer for a period just till people have got used to the new norm, if you like, at level 2.
I've just got some questions from itinerant teachers of singing and instrumental music around the country. One person says, can we teach vocal lessons safely at level 2? The Ministry of Education guidelines say this is possible, but what are your views on this?
I mean, again, it seems reasonable in the school environment, just for the reasons we've been discussing.
Sure. Should we be only teaching a maximum of, say, 2 students at a time rather than 4 or 5 in a small room?
I think, again, it's the space. The dilution is your friend with viruses that are transmitted in this way, and distance is your friend. So I think if you've got a nice, well-ventilated, large room, and maybe if singing and music lessons can be prioritized for having spaces in halls, if that's possible, I think that would be a good policy. And then I think larger groups should be quite reasonable.
So, well ventilated, is it worth, even though we're heading into winter and obviously some parts of the country will get very cold, is it actually better to have the windows open when teaching?
Not necessarily. One of the strange things about these viruses that they like cold and they like dry air. So probably actually having a warmer environment may be better, may be preferable. And when I say ventilation, you don't need a huge draft. It's just really having quite a bit of air around you, so the virus has a chance to settle down, which is what the droplets have a chance to settle to the ground easily. Sure.
A question from some itinerant teachers who move from school to school. They want to know if they're safe to do that.
Yeah, I mean, again, the guidelines allow that. And I think if they're observing reasonable precautions, that seems reasonable to me.
And then just some questions about teachers who are teaching in their own home. Schools obviously have the benefit of industrial cleaners coming in. What hygiene and sanitation guidelines would you suggest for someone who's teaching from their own home?
Yeah, again, I think if you think about how the virus is transmitted, it's mainly respiratory droplets. So it's the precautions about having reasonable spacing and ideally having the lessons taught in a large room so people aren't too close together. I think that would be the main precaution. And it is useful to wipe down surfaces with a cleaning agent between visits. But I don't think people should get carried away with that, because it would be it could get very tedious. I mean, I think it's just, if you think, what are the surfaces that people are likely to touch? And hand washing is going to be, again, a key precaution.
Yes. Just something very quickly about orchestras and choirs. There's conflicting information about whether playing brass or woodwind instruments is more or less risky than talking or singing. And again, I don't want to put you on the spot here, but do you have any advice about how to mitigate the risks for groups that include wind and brass players, such as concert bands or orchestras?
Yeah, well, I think anything that involves a lot of breathing, singing and playing wind instruments is going to generate a larger aerosol and more droplets. So I think the same rules apply. I actually haven't seen outbreaks related to wind instruments or orchestras. Certainly they are very well documented with choirs, but maybe you've read about outbreaks in that setting. I'm not sure.
And there's another question here. Once we move to level 1, how close should a choir stand and sing behind an orchestra?
Well, I think level 1, it may be just almost business as usual. It hasn't been defined, but the thing about level 1, it's going to be very much around borders and the ability to do contact tracing when required. And it may be a chance when we get some digital tools to help. And some of us think face masks on the transport system will be the other precaution at that level, but most things will not be necessary at level 1.
Great, thank you for that.
Michael, we did say to people that if they had messages they wanted to send through in the chat and things that we hadn't yet covered, that we would accept some questions from the floor. So I think they were going to come through to Juliet if there were any. Have you had any, Juliet?
Just a couple here. One is about whether there's a prospect of rapid tests being available in New Zealand, and whether that, because that was something that was discussed in the apocryphal webinar, about something that might have to happen before rehearsals could take place. So just wondering if that's something that's likely to be on the horizon in New Zealand, whether that's a useful part of a process.
Yeah, the rapid testing will have a place, and there's some suggestion it might be used at airports and so on. But really, it doesn't have much value for this kind of situation, because if you really thought there was enough circulating virus that you might want to start testing people, we'd be in a different situation, I think. This is, a lot of these ideas, of course, have come from overseas, where you have got a lot of infected people still, and where testing is very important, and that the test idea is very much part of control. But in New Zealand, the policy is you get tested if you have symptoms or you've been exposed in some way, but not testing as a screen, say, before you can go and sing or whatever.
It makes sense. Another a question relating back to the venues discussion we had earlier. Someone's asking whether the height of a room makes a difference. So, for instance, in a church, you're going to have a much higher stud height. Does that make any difference to the available ventilation?
Yeah, I think, again, just more air for that volume of droplets to disperse into is useful. But generally, the height may not be so important, because you're mainly concerned about these bigger droplets that are going to fall out onto the floor and have a short range. But everyone who studies respiratory diseases knows there isn't an absolute distinction between droplets and aerosols. If you've got droplets, by definition, you're going to have aerosols as well, and you may have some particles that float around for long periods. But the quantity of virus there will be much less. So it's all about exposure, and that's the intensity and the duration of the drivers. So yes, you can often pick up bits of RNA even days later on all sorts of services, it doesn't mean that anyone can get infected from that. It just means the tests are very sensitive. So I think it has created quite a bit of anxiety about things that don't happen very often. I mean, the main thing is still being close to someone who's putting out a lot of viral particles. And that's why, again, even simple fabric masks are so effective, because they just stop that generation at source.
And those are the questions, Juliet. That's all we've got from the floor, as it were.
There was one more about microphones and whether they whether they should be sanitized between use of, which I would have thought would make sense.
Yeah.
Between people.
Yes. No, I think that sounds very sensible. I imagine there would be guidelines for that. I haven't actually seen anything on that, but if you just think about the microphone and the number of particles, or respiratory particles, that are going to impact on that, it would seem to be one of those things that you really would want to clean.
So Michael, just to summarise really what you've said this evening, and we're hugely grateful to you for giving up your time and coming and talking to us specifically and to our community about COVID-19 and choral singing. And really, to sum up, I think what you've said is that in level 2, at the moment at least, it's 10, maximum of 10 singers for community choirs. Schools are a different situation, but for community and church choirs, it's a maximum of 10, and that your recommendation would be that we wait until level 1, even if the numbers go up, that we wait until level 1 before we resume our normal rehearsals.
I think that's a grey area, because I haven't seen what may be suggested. I would say just follow the guidelines. If the guidelines say it's okay, I would do that.
Okay,
because,
so if in 2 weeks' time we're told 20 or
yeah.
50, yep.
But I think it's going to be based on what the virus is doing, and we call this a stochastic process. It's all about probability and risk, and the less virus there is, the more we approach elimination, the lower the risk. And I think the guidelines may be slightly loosened as a result. So I would say just follow that.
And you said about intensity and duration. So if we are rehearsing with, say, up to 10 people, it's 1 metre, 1.5, 2. We're hearing all these different things. What's your recommendation? Maybe a little bit wider for a bit more space for singers?
I think for singers, yes. I think trying to stick with 2 metres if you can.
2 metres, yeah. And duration, if you were rehearsing and there were 10 of you rehearsing, would you limit that rehearsal to maximum an hour, or?
I think the suggestion is up to 2 hours, and
up to 2.
If you're being conservative, you might cut that down a bit, because you are putting out a lot more of these particles than people standing at a bus shelter, for instance. So, I mean, maybe people sing in bus shelters, I don't know, but but I think the numbers and, as you say, numbers and duration and contact is the approximately the key things.
And then when we go to level 1, eventually we'll be following all those good guidelines about making sure we're keeping, our contact lists up to date. People sign in at rehearsals. I know you said it'll be pretty much business as usual at level 1, but there are certain things, protocols that we'll want to keep in place, like hand washing and not sharing drinks and snacks in the breaks and things like that, I imagine. Yeah,
I mean, it is going to be much more relaxed, but one of the benefits, of course, of being through this whole experience, we're obviously a lot more conscious of sharing viruses, and really influenza still kills 500 people a year in New Zealand, and that number could be reduced by just practicing these infection control methods that we've learnt about.
Juliet.
Well, thank you so much, Michael, for sharing your expertise and your knowledge, and for giving us some of your precious time. I'm sure that time spent not discussing COVID-19 must be a pretty short supply for you these days. We're really grateful that you've been able to help us try and find some clarity around singing activities. They're so important to us all. Just some closing thoughts. It seems to us that we in Aotearoa have got a chance at the moment to be either a shining example or a horrible warning. I think everybody's going to be watching us. So as we proceed into level 2 and beyond, we'd urge everybody listening to adopt not the 3 S's, the 3 C's. Be cautious, be consistent with each other and with the guidelines, and be collaborative. So let's keep talking. NZCF is committed to being a reliable source of information and a forum for discussion. So please do, let's keep in touch. And if you possibly can, please make sure that you and your choir are members of NZCF and ACD this year. We're a membership-based organisation, so actual members are our lifeblood, but as well as that, the weight of membership numbers adds strength to any advocacy that we engage in. And we want to be sure that choral voices are part of the conversation as we move through this year. Thanks again to everyone who's sent in questions and watched tonight, and a summary of the findings. I think, Chrissy, and the link to the video will be posted on the website and Facebook page tomorrow sometime.
That's right. Thank you so much, Michael. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Great to meet you.